The rain had been falling on Ashcombe House since before dawn, a thin, persistent February rain that found its way through the seams of the old windows and pooled, faintly, on the sills of the long library. By 10 o'clock, when the family had gathered for the reading of the will, the fires had been lit in both hearths, and still the room held a chill that no flame seemed able to touch, the particular cold of a house that has recently lost the man who once commanded its warmth. She had been given no seat. She had not expected one. She stood near the tall windows with her hands folded before her, in a gray wool dress gone thin at the elbows, the hem still damp from the walk up from the village. Her boots, her father's boots, cut down and resoled twice, left a faint print on the marble that she found herself watching, rather than looking up at the assembled company, the black-clad cousins, the aunts with their rustling silks, the senior trustee with his spectacles, and his ledgers stacked before him like small fortifications. It was he who spoke first, when the room had gone as quiet as such a room ever does. "We are joined," he said, consulting a paper, though he did not seem to need it, by Miss Fairweather, the bindery girl. He paused, allowing the words their weight. "Here on charity, at the late Duke's insistence, to see to the library. She has no interest in these proceedings beyond that." There was laughter, not loud, not cruel in the way a slap is cruel, but soft, the kind that moves through a room like a draft under a door, touching everyone and warming no one. A cousin's gloved hand rose briefly to a mouth. Someone murmured something about the old Duke's fondness for strays. "She may stand by the door," the trustee added, not unkindly, as one might direct a servant toward the tradesman's entrance. "With the others." She did not flush. She had trained herself, over 3 winters of mended spines and cracked leather in the cold room off the kitchens, not to flush at such things, though the training had cost her something each time it was used. She moved to the door, where the footman and the housekeeper stood with their own hands folded, and she took her place among them as though it were the most natural thing in the world, as though she had not spent 3 winters bent over the old Duke's books by candlelight, while he read aloud to her from letters no one else had been permitted to see. At the head of the table, the new Duke said nothing. He had said very little since his father's death, and less still since the mourning coach had brought him back from the war, to a house full of black crepe and whispered arithmetic. He glanced once toward the door, toward the woman standing among the servants with her chin level and her eyes on the middle distance, and then he looked away again, as though she were no more remarkable than the rain against the glass. The trustee cleared his throat and unfolded the will. To understand how she came to stand there at all, one must go back 3 winters, to a January so wet that the Thames had crept brown and swollen against its banks, and Ashcombe Hall's western wing had flooded through a cracked gutter no one had thought to mend since autumn. The old Duke's library, 1,100 volumes, some inherited from a grandfather who had bought them by the crate at Continental auctions, some acquired by his own hand, had taken the worst of it. Water had crept along the lower shelves like a slow and patient thief, swelling boards, softening leather, turning gilt lettering to a bruised and illegible smear. She had arrived on a Tuesday, in her father's good coat let out at the shoulders because her own was too thin for the cold, carrying a satchel of tools that had been his, bone folders worn smooth as river stones, a paste-brush with bristles gone soft from 40 years of use, a small knife whose handle still held the shape of his grip better than her own. He had died 11 weeks before, in November, of a fever that took him in 9 days, leaving her the bindery, its debts, and a reputation for careful hands that she had earned at his elbow since she was old enough to hold a needle without bleeding on the vellum. The housekeeper had shown her to the ruined shelves with the air of a woman conferring a small mercy, and had not expected her to stay past the fortnight. But she had knelt on the cold stone floor among the swollen books, and she had worked the way her father taught her, patiently, without haste, testing each volume's temper before she touched it, as though the paper itself might be persuaded rather than forced. Within a month, the housekeeper had stopped hovering. Within 2, the old Duke himself had begun to appear in the doorway of the cold room off the kitchens where she worked, watching without speaking, as though the sight of a book being coaxed back from ruin were a species of prayer he had not known he needed. He had asked her name on the 17th day. He had asked to see her father's tools on the 23rd. By the second winter, he was reading to her from letters he kept in a locked drawer, and teaching her, over the slow unwinding of long evenings, a private shorthand of his own devising, a cipher built from the marginalia of his youngest days, half whim, half habit, meant for no one but the two of them and the silence of the cold room. No one else in the house had ever troubled to learn it. The cold room off the kitchen smelled always of leather paste and beeswax, of vinegar used to lift old mildew, and beneath it, faintly, of the tallow candles she was permitted to burn only until the second bell. She had grown used to the smell before she had grown used to the house itself, had come to think of it, in the way of the very young, as the smell of being tolerated. She did not yet understand that it would become, in time, the smell of being wanted. That first winter was long, and the manor was colder than any house she had known, for the old Duke kept his fires banked out of habit from leaner years, though there was no longer any need for thrift. She worked with her sleeves pinned back and her fingers stiff, testing the swollen bindings the way her father had shown her, a light pressure at the spine, a patient ear for the small complaint of glue giving way, never force, never haste. She spoke to the books, sometimes, when she thought herself alone. She did not know, for the first fortnight, that she was not. He came without ceremony, the way old men come to rooms they have decided are theirs by right of ownership rather than use. He would stand in the doorway with his hands folded behind him, saying nothing, watching her work a cracked spine back into patience, and she would feel the weight of his attention, the way one feels weather change before it arrives. He asked no questions at first. He only watched, as though trying to determine what manner of creature had been let into his house. It was the 17th day he asked her name, gruffly, as if the asking cost him something. She told him. He grunted, and did not offer his own, though she had known it since before she could read. It was the 23rd day he asked to see her father's tools, the bone folder worn smooth at the grip, the small brass hammer, the awl kept wrapped in oiled cloth, and turned each one over in his hands with an attention she had not expected from a man who owned, by her reckoning, some 4,000 books he had likely never opened. By the second winter he was no longer merely watching. He brought letters from a locked drawer she was never shown the key to, and read them aloud to her in the evenings while she worked, his voice dropping into something almost unguarded in the low light. He began, without explaining why, to teach her a private shorthand of his own devising, built, he told her once, from the marginalia of his youngest days, half whim, half habit, and she learned it the way she learned everything, slowly, without complaint, until it lived in her hand as surely as it lived in his. No one else in the house had ever troubled to learn it. No one else, she understood only much later, had ever troubled to be taught. The tea was always the same tea, a china pot with a hairline crack along the spout, mended once and mended badly, so that it wept a thin brown thread down the side, no matter how carefully it was poured. He would not let it be replaced. She noticed this, the way she noticed everything about him, sideways, without comment, filing it among the small facts that made up the shape of a man who owned 4,000 books and one cracked pot, and seemed, in his own house, equally attached to both. He called it a naval game the first evening he explained it properly, though she suspected even then that this was a kindness offered to spare them both the weight of the truth. Officers at sea, he told her, stirring his cup though he took no sugar, had once used such substitutions to pass sailing orders past enemy eyes, a letter standing for another letter, a number standing for a word, the whole business unlocked by a single key phrase, carried only in the mind. He said this lightly, as though it were an amusement fit for a wet evening and nothing more, and she let him believe she received it as such, because she understood, without being told, that the lightness was the price of his teaching it at all. She learned the key phrase before she learned the letters, a line from some forgotten psalm he recited once and never explained, and never asked her to explain back to him, though she came to know it better than her own name. He taught her in fragments, across many evenings, never impatient when her hand faltered, never once suggesting that a bookbinder's daughter had no business holding a duke's private language in her fingers. She wondered, sometimes, watching him turn the poker in the grate rather than look at her while he spoke of his boyhood, whether he taught her because there was no one else left in the house who would sit long enough to be taught. She kept this thought to herself, as she kept most things. It would not have done to let him see how she hoarded these evenings, the fire low, the rain steady against the library glass, his voice unspooling old naval fictions that were plainly something else entirely, as though they were coins to be counted later, alone, in the cold of her own room above the bindery. No one asked after her there. No one waited for her hand at the door. It was only in this house, among his books and his cracked pot and his invented alphabet, that she felt herself attended to, and she guarded the feeling as fiercely as she guarded any ledger, telling herself, when she permitted herself to think of it at all, that she was merely a useful pupil, and that a useful pupil owed her teacher nothing more than diligence. That was in the 4th winter of the lessons, when she was 21, and had begun, without admitting it, to count the days between visits to the house, as a woman counts coins she must not spend too quickly. What followed came faster than she had prepared for, as such things always do. Her father's cough, which had troubled him through 2 Christmases and been dismissed by both of them as the ordinary complaint of a man who breathed glue and leather dust for a living, thickened by the following autumn into something the apothecary would not name plainly. He died in February, in the small hours, with the rain doing to the bindery windows what it had always done to the library glass at the great house, and she sat with his hands, stained permanently, she noticed, even in death, with the ink of 40 years, until the light came up gray over the rooftops. There was no one to inherit but her. There was also, she discovered within the month, very little to inherit: a lease, 3/4 spent, tools that fetched almost nothing from the dealer who took them, and debts she had not known existed, settled quietly and completely by the sale of everything her father had owned, save the clothes on her back and 1 box of his private papers, which she could not bring herself to part with, even for the ready money it might have brought. It was the old Duke who kept her from the workhouse, though he never once used that word to her, nor permitted her to use it to herself. He proposed, in the mild, oblique manner he reserved for matters he considered beneath discussion, that she continue coming to the library, to catalogue, to repair the bindings her father had once tended, to make herself useful in whatever small ways presented themselves. There was no mention of wages in the 1st year, nor the 2nd, nor the 3rd. There was a room made over for her at the top of the east stair, cold in winter and close in summer, and there was food sent up on a tray by servants who had opinions about her presence, which they were careful never to voice in her hearing, but not always careful enough. She told herself this was employment. She told herself this was enough. She had, after all, the books, and the fire, and the old man's slow, unspooling voice in the evenings, speaking now more of ciphers and less of ships, as though he sensed some clock running down that she did not yet permit herself to hear. 3 years passed in this fashion, quietly, without wages, without complaint, until the morning the old Duke did not come down to the library at all, and the house filled instead with black crape and lawyers. The room did not so much return to itself as reassemble, piece by piece, the way a held breath resumes only after some smaller catastrophe has passed. Mr. Cray cleared his throat twice, adjusted his spectacles, and found his place upon the page with the fussy precision of a man determined to prove that nothing irregular had occurred, though the ink smudge on his thumb suggested otherwise. The estate at Marlow Fell, he read, in the flat recitative reserved for such occasions, together with its tenancies, its rents, and its appurtenances, shall pass according to the schedule appended hereto. He paused. He did not look up, which schedule, as the family is aware, requires further clarification. The word sat awkwardly in his mouth, like a stone he had not meant to swallow. He read on. He read the smaller bequests, a sum to a cousin in Bath, a set of hunting guns to a nephew who had not troubled to attend, an annuity to a housekeeper long since pensioned off to Devon, and the room received each item with the particular restlessness of people waiting for the one matter that concerned them to be addressed while pretending to attend to matters that did not. She sat near the door still, though the chair no longer felt like punishment so much as vantage. From it she could see the whole table, the trustees' fingers, pale and still, resting on the ledger he had not opened since it had been handed back to him, the dowager's face, composed but watchful, the assembled cousins arranging themselves into postures of patient grief that would not survive the reading of their own bequests. And she could see him, Lord Edmund, at the head of the table, one hand flat upon the wood, unmoving, his eyes moving from face to face, with the particular coldness of a man auditing a room full of debtors. He watched Mr. Cray as though the lawyer's every syllable were a small dishonesty, to be caught and pinned. He watched the trustee longer than courtesy required, and when his gaze passed over her, it did not linger, but it did not entirely pass either. It settled for the length of one breath, assessing, withholding, the way a man might look at a locked door he had not yet decided whether to open. "The codicil," Mr. Cray said at last, "being in a hand and cipher unfamiliar to this office, and to the trustees, cannot at present be rendered into terms binding upon the estate." "Then render it," Lord Edmund said. His voice was quiet. It silenced the room more thoroughly than shouting could have done. "Your Grace, the matter is one of some delicacy." "The matter," he said, "is one of my father's wishes, sitting unread upon your table, while my family argues over guns and annuities. Render it, or tell me plainly that you cannot." Mr. Cray's mouth opened. No sound emerged. Every eye in the room, slowly, unwillingly, turned toward the girl by the door. Eleanor did not move at first. She had learned, in 3 winters of standing at the edges of rooms like this one, that stillness was its own kind of armor, and that a woman who moved too quickly drew attention she could not afford. But the silence had teeth now, and it was pulling at her, the way a hook pulls at water, slow, then sudden. The trustee's face had gone the color of old tallow. He did not look at her. He looked instead at the codicil, at the cramped lines crowding the bottom third of the page, ink gone brown and thin, where the old Duke's hand had begun to fail him, and his mouth worked once more, without producing anything a lawyer could be paid for. "It is," he managed finally, "a private notation, perhaps a memorandum to himself. It need not concern." "It concerns the estate," the new Duke said, "or my father would not have troubled to write it in a hand no one in this room can read." He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. The room had already gone the particular quiet of people counting what they stood to lose. The dowager's fan had stopped moving entirely, held flat against her knee like a thing forgotten. One of the cousins, the elder Miss Ashcombe, whose mourning gloves were new enough to still smell of the shop, leaned to whisper something to her sister, and was silenced by a look from no one in particular, only the weight of the room itself. Mr. Cray turned the page toward the candlelight, as though better illumination might resolve symbols that were not letters at all, but small closed shapes, loops within loops, marks that might have been numerals or might have been nothing, the private alphabet of a dying man who had trusted no one with his true intentions except, evidently, whoever had taught it to him, or been taught it by him, in a room this family had never entered. "It is not French," he said, half to himself, "nor Latin cipher of any school I know. Your Grace, I must be candid. This office cannot render what it cannot read, and I would advise the family that the will, as regards this final provision, may stand unexecuted pending." "Pending what?" It was not a question. Pending my father's wishes being quietly buried under procedure, the way everything inconvenient in this house is buried. No one answered him. The trustee's eyes moved, briefly, involuntarily, toward the ledger at his elbow, and then away again, and Eleanor, watching from her place near the door, where the draught came cold beneath the sill and dampened the hem of her one good dress, felt something in her chest tighten that was not quite fear and not quite hope, but lay somewhere adjacent to both, the way grief and recognition can occupy the same breath. She knew that hand. She knew those loops within loops, the small, deliberate slant of them, the way the old Duke had pressed too hard on downstrokes when his fingers ached with cold. She had taught him nothing he had not first offered to teach her. It was the dowager who broke the silence, though she did not mean to be helpful, and would have been offended to be thanked for it. "He did used to play at codes," she said, from her chair by the fire, not troubling to raise her voice, as though the matter were of no more consequence than a remark about the weather holding fine. With that bindery girl, the one who mended his books. I remember it because he was insufferable about it at dinner. Would not tell any of us what the little marks meant, only smiled into his soup like a boy, with a secret frog in his pocket. She paused, and turned her rings, and added, with the particular cruelty of those who do not raise their voice because they have never needed to, one does not expect it to have amounted to anything. The room's attention moved. It moved slowly, the way attention does when it is unwilling, each face turning by degrees toward the door, toward the draft, toward the girl standing where the damp had already begun to darken the hem of her dress. She felt it arrive on her the way one feels a hand laid flat against the back of the neck, not violent, but total. "That girl," said one of the lawyers, as though confirming a fact he found distasteful to hold in his mouth. "The one they brought in for the reading. Surely she cannot." "Surely," said the trustee, recovering himself with the swiftness of a man glad of any current that carries attention away from his ledger. "We are not to entertain the notion that a bindery girl holds the key to His Grace's private affairs. It would be irregular. It would be—" He seemed to search for a word large enough to dismiss her with, and settled, unimaginatively, on unsuitable. No one asked her directly. That, she would think later, was the particular shape of the humiliation, not that she was accused of anything, but that she was discussed, over her own head, as though she were a piece of furniture whose provenance was in doubt. The new Duke did not join the murmuring. He had gone very still, the way he had been still at the graveside, and his eyes, when they found her by the door, held something she could not yet read. Not warmth, not yet, but the flicker of a man recalculating a sum he had thought long closed. He remembered, perhaps for the first time in years, a particular evening, his father, laughing over a page of nonsense marks, refusing to explain, saying only that the bindery girl had a better head for it than half the fellows at his club. "Bring her forward," he said. It was not loud. It did not need to be. The room's soft laughter, so easy a moment before, died somewhere in its throat, and Eleanor, feeling every eye upon her damp hem and her chapped hands, stepped away from the draught and toward the long table, uncertain whether she had just been rescued or condemned. The distance between the doorway and the long table was not great, perhaps a dozen paces across worn carpet, but she felt every one of them as a separate reckoning, the way a debtor might count out coins she did not have. The trustees parted for her without quite looking at her, the way one steps aside for a draft rather than a person, and she was aware, with the particular cruelty of such awareness, of the exact state of her gloves, mended twice at the thumb, and of the ink that had not fully washed from beneath one nail despite an hour's scrubbing that morning. He did not rise to meet her. He remained seated at the head of the table, one hand flat upon the will's scattered pages, as though holding down something that might otherwise take flight, and when she stood before him, he studied her, with the frank, unhurried suspicion of a man totting a ledger he expects to find short. "You will understand," he said, "that I extend this only because no one else in this room can read my father's hand, and not because I believe you innocent of having some part in why it cannot be read." His voice held no heat. That was its particular chill, the absence of any need to raise it. "If this page yields nothing, or if it yields something convenient to your own advantage, I will treat it as fraud, and I will treat you as its author. Do you understand me?" "I do, my lord," she said, and her voice did not shake, though her hands, folded before her, had gone quite white at the knuckles. He held the appendix a moment longer than was necessary. She noticed that, the small theater of his reluctance, the way his fingers pressed briefly at its edge, as though testing whether it might still be withheld, before he set it before her. The paper was cool and slightly foxed at the corners, and the marks upon it, close set and deliberate, rose to meet her eye like the face of someone long absent, suddenly returned. She recognized them instantly, the way one recognizes a voice in another room before the words resolve into sense. The doubled strokes for numerals, the small looping flourish he had always insisted, marked a name rather than a sum. The private joke of it, 3 winters gone, made in a library that smelled of tallow and old vellum, and the particular dust of books no one else had troubled to open. "I shall want it back by morning," Lord Edmund said, already looking away from her, as though the matter, and she with it, had already been filed and closed, untouched in its meaning, unaltered in its intent. "You will work under the housekeeper's eye, and you will not leave the east room until it is done." Behind her, someone exhaled, not quite a laugh, but its cousin, and Eleanor did not turn to see whose breath it had been. Her hands, when she reached for the page, betrayed her utterly. The fingers were stained at the second knuckle with the particular gray-black that came from cheap ink and long habit, and they would not be still. She saw the trembling before she felt it, watched her own hand as though it belonged to a stranger being asked to perform a feat beyond her competence, and she despised the weakness, even as she could not command it away. The brass key at her throat, worn on its ribbon since her father had pressed it into her palm the winter he died, caught the candlelight and threw a small coin of brightness against her collar, and she found herself gripping the page too tightly, as if the paper itself might steady what her nerves would not. "I will need the room to myself," she said, and was startled to hear how level her voice came out, when nothing else in her was level at all. Lord Edmund's gaze returned to her then, briefly, with something in it that was not quite surprise, but adjacent to it, the look of a man recalculating a sum he had believed already settled. "The housekeeper remains," he said. "The housekeeper may remain at the door, not at my shoulder. I cannot think with breath on my neck, my lord, and this," she lifted the page an inch, no more, "wants thinking." A silence followed in which several of the assembled lawyers shifted in their chairs, and one of the trustees, the elder one, whose signature sat thick and confident at the foot of every ledger she had ever been permitted to touch, made a small sound of disapproval that he did not trouble to disguise as anything else. Lord Edmund did not look at him. He looked instead at the key at her throat, for a moment longer than courtesy required, and something in his face closed over again, as a door closes when a draught moves through a house at night, not slammed, only settled back into its frame. "The housekeeper at the door, then," he said. "You will have candles, and paper of your own, and nothing else. If a single mark upon that page is altered, blotted, or torn, you will answer for it before this family and these gentlemen, and I promise you the answering will not be gentle." "I would expect nothing less," she said, and did not know, until the words were out, whether they had been courage or simply exhaustion wearing courage's coat. He inclined his head, not a bow, nothing so generous as that, merely an acknowledgment that the matter was concluded, and turned to the housekeeper, giving low instruction she did not trouble to hear, her attention already falling back to the page, to the doubled strokes, and the small looping flourish that was not a sum but a name, and to the long, dim corridor of the east room where she would spend the night proving herself right, or ruining herself trying. The east room had not been used for company in some years. That much was plain from the smell of it. Cold plaster, old wax, a thread of damp coming off the flags that no fire, however built up, seemed able to chase entirely away. The housekeeper had laid coal generously, more generously, she suspected, than instruction required, and had set 2 candles instead of 1, without being asked, and had said nothing at all as she did it, only looked at her once, briefly, in the way of a woman deciding privately whether a thing was worth her opinion, and deciding, for the present, that it was not. She waited until the door had shut and the footsteps had gone the length of the corridor and down, and only then did she draw the small case from the pocket sewn into her petticoat, where it had ridden, unremarked, through every year since the bindery. It was not much to look at. A workbook, cheap board covers softened at the corners to the texture of cloth, her father's hand upon the flyleaf in ink, gone the color of weak tea, his name, the year, a bookbinder's careful, unlovely lettering. Between its pages, where a less careful woman might have lost it a dozen times over, lay a scrap of paper no larger than a folded handkerchief, so worn along its creases that she unfolded it now the way one might unfold a moth's wing, with the flat of 2 fingers only, breath held. The old Duke's hand, from 3 winters past. Rows of marks that meant nothing to anyone living but her. small looped strokes, standing in for letters he had found too plain to trust to plain letters, numerals doing double duty as both themselves and as disguise. The whole of it born one wet February afternoon, in the library, when he had set down a book he was too proud to admit he could no longer read easily, and said, half in jest, half not, that a man in his position ought to have one language nobody else could steal from him. She had thought, more than once in 3 years, of destroying it. A companion's habits did not include the keeping of a dead man's private code. Not once his son sat cold and suspicious at the head of the table. Not once the whole of the household had made plain what class of woman she was thought to be. But her hands had never quite managed the burning of it. She told herself, each time, that it was carefulness, that a bookbinder's daughter did not destroy paper lightly, whatever was written on it. Now, laying the scrap flat beside the will's torn appendix, she understood it had never been carefulness at all. It had been the last unbroken thing between herself and a man who had trusted her enough to make her the sole keeper of his secrets. She trimmed the candle, drew a fresh sheet toward her, and began, letter by letter, to remember him. The first symbols came easily, the way the beginning of a familiar hymn comes easily even to a voice long out of use. She had not translated in 3 years, not since the library was finished, and there was no more cause for notes passed between shelves, but the hand of it returned to her fingers before it returned to her mind. The slant he gave his false vowels, the small hook he used for a doubled consonant, learned, he had told her once, from a Portuguese merchant who had cheated him honestly at cards. She smiled at the memory before she could stop herself, and then, because there was no one to see the smile, she let it stay. The candle guttered lower. Outside, the rain had thinned to something quieter, more patient, a rain that intended to last until morning without hurry. She fed the flame from the second candle stub she had begged from the housekeeper, and bent again to the page. It was in the 3rd winter of their acquaintance, she remembered this precisely, the way one remembers the weather of a particular grief, that he had begun to fail. Not suddenly. A cough that would not leave him through Advent, a slowness on the stair he pretended was the stair's fault, and not his own. He had kept working nonetheless, later into each evening than his physician liked, and it was in those late hours, when the household had gone to bed, and only she remained to hand him books he no longer trusted himself to fetch, that he had begun speaking of things she had not been meant to carry alone. He had said, more than once, that he did not sleep for thinking of the Fell families. He said it plainly the first time, and then, as the cough worsened, he had said it only in fragments. The Fell families ought not to answer for another man's arithmetic. And once, near the end, gripping her wrist with a strength that had frightened her more than his weakness ever had, he had said, "Cray's numbers do not add as they ought, and I have not the years left to prove it properly." She had thought it the wandering of a sick man. She had written it off, gently, in her own mind, as the sort of anxious circling that illness brings to men accustomed to command and newly unable to exercise it. She had not asked what he meant by Cray's numbers, because to ask would have been to admit how frightened she was of losing him, and there had been no room, in those last months, for 2 frightened people in one library. Now, with the codicil unfolding letter by letter beneath her pen, she understood that he had not been wandering at all. He had been leaving a door ajar in the one language he trusted no one else to open, so that when the numbers finally came apart, as he must have known they would, someone would be standing close enough to hear the seam tear. She dipped the pen again and did not stop. The candle had burned low enough that its light no longer reached the far corners of the study, and it was in that thickening dark that the door opened without a knock, and the butler came in bearing a tray. He set it down at her elbow with the particular carefulness of a man who has carried a great many trays into a great many rooms of grief, and said nothing at first, only fed the small fire with 2 lumps of coal from a brass scuttle he must have brought up from the kitchens himself, at an hour when the maids were long abed. The tea steamed. She had not asked for it. She had not, in truth, noticed until that moment how cold her hands had become, nor how the cold had crept into the joints of her fingers, and begun, quietly, to slow her pen. "You needn't stay," she said, though she did not look up from the page. "No, miss," he agreed, and did not go. He stood instead, a little apart from the lamp, in the manner of a man accustomed to being present without being seen, and after a moment he said, in a voice pitched low enough that it seemed meant more for the fire than for her, that he had been 41 years in this house. That he had carried the old Duke's letters as a boy of 14, and shaved him as a man, and in the final winter had carried rather more silence up and down these stairs than he cared to remember. He did not say this as complaint. He said it the way a man recites a text he has long since stopped questioning, and only now, in the telling, hears differently. Mr. Cray came often, those last months, he said, oftener than the solicitor's business required, if you'll permit an old servant's opinion on such things. Always with papers, always asking that the room be cleared while they spoke. He paused, and the coal shifted in the grate. I did not care for the manner of it. His Grace, the elder, was not a man easily made afraid, but he was afraid, those last visits. I saw it and said nothing, for it was not my place to see it. She set down her pen. You are telling me now, she said. I am telling you now, he agreed, because it seems, miss, that someone at last is reading what he could not say aloud. He did not elaborate further, nor did his face invite her to press him. He only refilled her cup, unasked, and drew the shawl that had slipped from the back of her chair up over her shoulders with the brisk, impersonal tenderness of a man tending to a task rather than a person, and withdrew toward the door. At the threshold he stopped once more, his hand upon the frame. He trusted you, miss, he said. I think he trusted very few people in the end. Then he was gone, and the fire cracked, and the cipher waited, patient as it had waited 3 winters already, for her to finish what it had begun. She did not move for a long while after the door had closed. The shawl sat heavy and strange upon her shoulders, still holding, faintly, the warmth of another hand, and she let it stay there, rather than examine why she did not shrug it off. Then she drew the appendix toward her once more, and dipped her pen, and began. The cipher was not cruel, only careful. The old Duke had never built a lock meant to keep her out, only one meant to keep everyone else at bay. She remembered the winter he had taught it to her, his ink-stained fingers guiding hers across a scrap of foxed paper by the library fire, laughing softly at her frown, calling her clever in a voice he used for no one else. That memory did the work her tired eyes could not. Symbol by symbol, she matched the small hooked marks against the private key her father had once helped bind into the backboard of a ledger no one else had thought worth opening, and slowly, painfully, the nonsense began to yield. The first hour gave her nothing but fragments, a numeral here, a broken word there. False starts she struck through, with a decisiveness she did not entirely feel. She learned to distrust her own eagerness, to check each symbol twice, before trusting the letter it wanted to become. The candle burned lower. Wax pooled and hardened unevenly along its side, and she noticed it only distantly, the way one notices weather through a window one has stopped looking out of. Then, near the second hour, a cluster of marks resolved themselves cleanly, all at once, as though the page itself had exhaled. Marlowe fell. She sat back. The words meant nothing yet. A place, a name, she had heard spoken in passing by trustees, who considered it a minor holding, hardly worth the ink used to record its rents. But something in the careful weight of the old Duke's hand around those 2 words told her it was not minor to him. He had pressed the pen hard enough that the paper had nearly torn. A man did not press so hard over a matter of small consequence. She found she had stopped breathing and made herself begin again. Her fingers, cramped now from hours of small exacting movements, trembled slightly as she reached for a fresh sheet to copy the phrase where she could see it plainly, apart from the thicket of unsolved symbols still surrounding it. She stared at it as one might stare at a single lit window in a dark street, proof that something within was awake, waiting, and had been waiting for a long time for someone willing to knock. Whatever lay folded inside those 2 words, she understood now that it was not a footnote. It was the reason the appendix had been written at all. She looked once toward the door, half expecting to find the butler still standing there, and finding only the empty frame and the low red glow of the coals, She turned back to the page and did not look away from it again. The clock in the great hall had just finished striking the half-hour when she heard him, not the butler's measured tread, nor the housekeeper's soft shuffle, but a heavier, uneven step that paused too long outside the library door before entering, as though the man attached to it had argued with himself the whole length of the corridor and lost. He came in without knocking, which told her something of his state before he spoke a word. His coat was still buttoned, as though he had not undressed for bed at all, and his hair had the disordered look of a man who had run his hands through it more than once in the dark. He did not look at the papers first. He looked at her face, briefly, the way one checks a barometer before a storm, and seemed to find nothing there worth remarking upon, for he said only, "I could not sleep." "No, my lord?" "I came to see that the fire was kept. It was not true, or not wholly true, and they both seemed to know it, for he did not go near the grate at all, but stood instead at the far end of the table, one hand resting on the back of a chair he did not sit in. "Your father used to sit up like this," he said, after a silence, long enough that she had returned half her attention to the page. "Not for accounts, for nothing at all. I would find him at this hour, with a book open and unread before him, and when I asked what troubled him, he would say, 'Nothing troubles me. I am only keeping the house company.'" He said the words carefully, as though testing whether they still fit in his mouth after so many years abroad. "He kept good company then," she said. "He kept everyone's company but his own family's, at the end." The bitterness in it was quiet, not sharp, the kind that had worn a groove rather than cut fresh. "I have been home 11 weeks, and I do not yet know a single person in this house whose motives I trust past the length of a sentence. Everyone wants something explained, or signed, or forgiven." He glanced at the appendix, at the small forest of ink she had made across it, including, I dare say, you. "I want nothing signed," she said, "and nothing forgiven that is not mine to forgive." He studied her a moment, the coals hissing low behind him, and something in his face shifted. Not warmth exactly, but the loosening of a man setting down, briefly, a weight he had carried up every staircase in the house since his return. "He trusted you," he said, not quite a question, "with things he told no one. With a cipher, my lord, nothing more. He was not a man who gave ciphers to people he did not trust." He turned toward the door, then stopped, his hand on the frame. "Finish it," he said. "Whatever it says, I would rather know it from you, at first light, than from a lawyer's mouth at noon." He left before she could answer, and the door did not quite close behind him. She sat a long moment after the door had failed to close, listening to the particular silence a great house keeps at that hour, the settling of old beams, the far-off complaint of a shutter not properly latched, the coals easing into themselves like something breathing its last. She did not go to shut the door herself. She had learned, in 11 weeks of her own, beneath other roofs not her father's, that a door left ajar by a man such as that one was rarely an oversight, and rarely an invitation either. It was simply a thing he had forgotten to finish, the way he had, she suspected, forgotten to finish a great many things since his return, grief being, in her limited observation, a poor housekeeper. She drew the appendix toward her again. Her hand, she noticed, no longer trembled as it had when the trustees pressed the page upon her in the hall below, expecting, she was certain, that she would fail and furnish them a private joke to carry into the drawing-room. There was a kind of strength in being underestimated so thoroughly. One had almost no dignity left to lose by trying. She had answered him plainly. She had not softened it. "I want nothing signed, and nothing forgiven that is not mine to forgive." She turned the sentence over now as she might turn a coin, testing whether she had meant it as boldly as it had sounded, and found, somewhat to her own surprise, that she had. He had not thanked her for it. He had not, she thought, thanked her for anything since the will was opened, not for the hours, not for the ink-stained fingers, not for the fact that she had not once asked what she might be paid for finishing what his father had begun and left, deliberately or not, for her hand alone. But he had watched her. She had felt it, the particular weight of being studied by a man accustomed to being obeyed rather than answered, and she had not looked away, and something in his face, she could not have named it warmth, would not have dared to, had shifted, briefly, the way ice shifts before it is anything so definite as water. He was not a man who gave ciphers to people he did not trust. She had not asked him to say it, she had not needed him to, but she found she was glad, in the quiet after he had gone, that he had said it anyway, gladder than pride alone could account for, and she set the thought aside, as one sets aside a candle too near the papers, not extinguished, only moved, so that it might not catch what it was not meant to burn. She trimmed the wick, and bent again to her father's, to the old Duke's, hand, and to the small dark forest of numbers, still waiting, unresolved, beneath the western margin. It was near midnight when the butler returned, not with tea this time, but with a ledger bound in cracked green calf, its corners soft with handling, and he set it down beside her candle with the particular care of a man delivering something he had not, strictly, been sent to fetch. "I do not recall being asked to bring this," he said, in the tone of a man closing a door he has just opened. "But it seemed to me the estate accounts for Marlow Fell might be of some use to a lady doing sums." She thanked him with her eyes rather than her voice, for her throat had gone dry with the particular fear of a woman handling something she had not been given leave to touch, and she drew the ledger toward her only after he had gone, as though distance might make the taking less like theft. The hand within was not the old Duke's. It was tighter, more upright, a clerk's hand trained to look honest rather than to be it, and she followed it down the column of figures for Marlow Fell, with her finger moving slower than her eye, the way her father had taught her to read a page twice, once for the words, once for what the words were hiding. The debt figure for the year of the drought stood at £412. She had, not an hour before, decoded that same year's entry in the codicil's private hand, the old Duke's hand, cramped and certain, numbering not pounds but bushels, not debt but yield, the western fields having in that year produced more than they had in a decade, drought notwithstanding, on account of the deep well old Hollis's father had dug at his own expense. A surplus, not a debt. She sat back from the candle as though it had grown suddenly hot, and read the ledger figure again, and then the codicil again, and found no comfort in a third reading, for the numbers did not soften with familiarity. They merely sat there, £412 owed against a year in which, by the old Duke's own private accounting, £380 had in fact been earned. Someone had reversed a fortune into a debt. She thought of the trustee's voice at the long table. The girl from the bindery, here on charity. And found the memory arriving with a new and colder weight. Not embarrassment now, but something closer to recognition. The particular chill of watching a man's contempt reveal itself as camouflage rather than character. She did not yet have the whole of it. A single year's discrepancy might be error, might be a clerk's tired hand, might be nothing at all beyond the ordinary carelessness of men who did not expect to be checked. But the codicil's western margin still held its dark, unresolved forest of figures, 3 more years of them, waiting, and she reached for her father's cipher key with fingers that had stopped, for the first time since sundown, trembling from fear rather than from cold. The candle had burned to a stub the width of her smallest finger, and its light had gone the color of weak tea, so that she worked now half by memory of where the letters sat upon the page, rather than by any true illumination. She did not call for another. To rise, to ring, to explain to some sleep-fogged servant why the bindery girl required tallow at 4 in the morning would have cost more than the darkness itself. The next figure resolved itself slowly, the way frost resolves on a window, not appearing so much as becoming visible, having been there all along. £90, written by the old Duke's hand as "Forgiven," and beside it, in the trustee's later ink, crossed through and rewritten as "Owed." She set her pen down, picked it up again. The room held no sound but the small violence of her own breath, fogging faintly an air gone cold enough to hold it, and the occasional collapse of ash in the grate behind her, settling lower, giving up its last warmth without complaint. She had stopped feeling her feet some hours before. She did not think of this as suffering. She thought of it, distantly, the way one thinks of weather in another county, and returned to the page. 4 years. 4 separate reversals, each one small enough alone to be mistaken for a clerk's error, each one written in the same patient, unhurried hand that had altered nothing else in the ledger, only this, only the Western tenancies, only the figures that stood between a family's forgiveness and a stranger's claim. She followed the cipher to its final clause, the one the old Duke had buried deepest, in the margin he had always called, in their old lessons, the place where a man keeps what he is afraid to say aloud. Her pen moved, without her quite willing it. The debt was not merely forgiven. It had never been a debt in the sense the ledger pretended. It was rent already paid twice over in labor the old Duke had chosen, deliberately, not to record as coin. And so the codicil did not simply erase what was owed. It granted the land itself, outright, to the families who worked it. She read the clause a second time, to be certain grief and cold had not conjured it. They had not. The words held their shape. Her hand, when she finally lifted it from the page, left a faint, damp print upon the paper, not ink, only the ordinary moisture of a living person who had been very still for a very long time. Beyond the window, the black had gone the particular soft gray that comes before anyone would admit to calling it morning. She did not move toward the door. She sat, instead, and waited for the house to wake, and for someone to ask her what she had found. She did not wait idly. There was one matter still unresolved, and she had learned, in 3 winters of restoring a dead man's shelves, that unresolved matters did not stay quiet on their own. She drew the ledger back toward her, the household ledger, not the will, its spine cracked from handling far more recent than its date, and began again at the Western Estates entries, this time not reading the numbers, but reading the hand that had made them. The old Duke's writing, in the early pages, was firm and slightly forward-leaning, the same confident slope she remembered from the margin notes he used to leave her, half in cipher, half in jest. But somewhere past the middle of the ledger, that hand began to falter, not gradually, as age alone would wear it, but unevenly, the way a hand fails when the mind behind it is losing its grip on the pen only in fits, some days better than others. She had seen this before, in the last letters he had dictated rather than written. She knew what failing looked like on a page. And there, laid beside that faltering hand, were entries that did not falter at all. Entries too steady, too even, too recently pressed into paper, that had aged around them but not with them. She held the page to the candle and tilted it, the way her father had taught her to check a forged binding, light along the grain, not against it. The ink of the altered rose sat higher on the fiber than the ink beside it, newer, though someone had taken care to match the color as closely as the shop could manage. Care, but not enough care. Forgery is patience pretending to be memory, her father used to say, and patience always shows its seams to someone who has spent a life among seams. She understood then, not merely that the figures had been changed, but when. The alterations had been made after the old Duke's hand had already begun its decline, timed, deliberately, to a season when a dying man could be trusted not to notice, and a son, too consumed by grief to look closely at columns his father could no longer defend. She wrote this down as plainly as she had written the codicil itself, without flourish, because flourish was not owed to men who altered figures in the dark. Somewhere below her, a door opened. Footsteps, unhurried, crossed the hall. She set down the pen, folded her hands, and waited for whoever it was to climb the stairs and find her still sitting exactly where they had left her. The footsteps belonged to the butler, who did not speak, but only inclined his head toward the stairs, and by that small gesture she understood the hour had come. She gathered her papers with the same care she had given the ledger's grain, edges aligned, ink dry, nothing left to chance, and followed him down through a house still gray with the last of the night, into the long library where the family had already gathered, drawn by summons she had not heard sent. The light through the tall windows was thin and colorless, the kind that makes every face look older than it is. She noted the trustee seated near the window, hands folded with a composure she recognized now as rehearsed rather than natural. She noted the Duke standing near the hearth, not seated, as though sitting would commit him to a verdict before he had heard the evidence. She noted the dowager's cane resting against her chair, and the lawyers arranged like men at a funeral they had not yet been told was theirs to attend. She did not wait to be invited to speak. Exhaustion had burned away whatever deference might once have kept her silent at the threshold. "The codicil," she said, "names the tenant families of Marlow Fell as the intended heirs of the Western estate, not in trust, not in reversion, but outright, upon the old Duke's death." She laid the translated page upon the table, turned so the room might read it without rising. The clause was written in the cipher because his lordship feared exactly what has since occurred, that the ledger recording debts against the estate would be altered to obscure his intention. She lifted the second page. "It has been altered here," she pointed, not at the trustee, but at the ink itself, as though the forgery might answer for itself better than any accusation she could make. The figures were changed after his lordship's hand had begun to fail, matched in color, but not in grain. Cloth remembers what men forget to check. No one spoke. The trustee's composure did not break outright, but something in his folded hands tightened, a small seizing that a room full of lawyers would have missed, and a bookbinder's daughter did not. "I am not accusing," she said quietly, "only reading. The document speaks for itself, if one is willing to hear it." The Duke had not moved from the hearth. His eyes were on the page, then on her, then on the trustee, in a slow arithmetic she could not yet read the sum of. Mr. Cray found his voice before he found his defense, and the two did not arrive together. "This is—" He stood, chair scraping the boards with a sound too loud for the room. "This is the fancy of a bindery girl reading tea leaves in old ink. I have served this family for 30 years. I will not be accused by—" He stopped himself, perhaps hearing how the sentence would end, and did not like the shape of it in his own mouth. "No one has accused you of anything you have not already written," she said, and did not raise her eyes from the page. He looked to the Duke for rescue, and found none offered. The Duke only watched him with the patient, terrible attention of a man, totting a column of figures he already suspects will not balance. "The dates," Cray said, and his voice had lost its height. "The dates prove nothing. Ink darkens with age. Any clerk will tell you. Any clerk who has never bound a ledger by hand," she said, "might believe that. I have bound 11 of them for this house alone. I know which years used the Whitby gall, and which the London mixture, and that his lordship changed suppliers the winter his hand began to shake, because I ordered the second batch myself, at his request, so that no one should remark upon the difference in his correspondence." She turned the page half an inch, so the light from the window struck it new. "You did not know that. You could not have known it, and so you matched a color you could see, and missed a grain you could not." The room's silence had a different quality now, not the polite hush of a will reading, but the held breath before a verdict. Cray's hands, which had been flat and steady upon the table, began, very slightly, to tremble. He looked at them as though they belonged to some other, older man. "I am 61 years of age," he said, and the bluster had gone out of him entirely, leaving something smaller and more exposed beneath it, like a house with its scaffolding stripped away before the render is dry. "I have no estate of my own, no pension but what this family sees fit to grant, and grant it sparingly, always. I did not think—" He stopped, began again, quieter still. "I did not think of the tenants at Marlow Fell as thieving from. I thought only that I had given 30 years, and would be given nothing back but a cold room and a colder dismissal, once the old Duke was gone, and no one left to remember what I was owed." The dowager's fan had stopped, mid-air, and did not resume. No one moved to speak for him. It was not cruelty that kept the room quiet, but the particular exhaustion that follows the collapse of a man who has been, for 30 years, merely disagreeable rather than dishonest. The discovery that both things can live in the same chest, side by side, unremarked, until a girl with a decoding key sets them apart on a page. It was the new Duke who rose first. He did it without ceremony, the way he might have risen to open a window against a closeness in the air, and for a moment no one understood what he meant to do. He crossed the length of the table, past the lawyers with their pens gone still, past the dowager's suspended fan, past the trustee who did not lift his eyes to watch him go, to where she stood, near the door, where she had been told to stand 2 hours before, among the servants, as though charity required a fixed address. He drew out the chair beside his own. It was a small motion, the scrape of wood against floor, no louder than a cleared throat, but every person at that table heard it as though it had been a pistol shot. The chair at the head of the table, second only to his, had been empty since the reading began, reserved, by unspoken custom, for whichever trustee might be called upon to confirm a figure, settle a doubt. It had not once occurred to anyone in that room that it might be offered to her. "Sit," he said, not unkindly, not gently either. Simply as a man states a fact he has settled in his own mind and does not intend to revisit. She did not move at once. Her hands, which had held steady through the long night's work, found something to do with the fold of her sleeve. "Your father's hand," he said, and something in his voice caught, briefly, on the word. "Father." The way a coat catches on a nail, not torn, but marked. "You have read it more truly than any man paid to read it. I would have the room hear it from you, not from me." The lawyers exchanged no glances. The dowager's fan, at last, resumed its slow arc, though her eyes did not leave the girl's face. She crossed the room the way she had crossed it hours before, without hurry, without apology, and lowered herself into the chair beside his, the wood still warm from where his hand had rested on its back. She did not smooth her skirts. She did not look toward the trustee, whose ruin she had authored without once raising her voice. She looked instead at the pages before her and began, in the same measured tone she might have used to read aloud from any ledger, to explain what the old duke had meant, and what his hand had hidden, and why. The explanation took the better part of an hour, and no one in that room moved to shorten it. When she had finished, the trustee who had altered the ledger sat very still, his hands flat upon the table, as though pressing down on something that had already escaped him. He did not speak again that day. Within a fortnight, letters had gone out under seal to every solicitor with an interest in the estate, and by the 3rd week of the month he was no longer named among those who managed the family's affairs, quietly removed, as such men always are, with no public accounting beyond a line in the estate's records, noting a change of trustee, dated and witnessed, nothing more. He kept his house in town. He kept, it was said, very little of his former confidence. The tenants of Marlow Fell, who had worked that land under 3 dukes, and paid rents that rose each year, for reasons none of them had ever been shown in writing, received in the following month a deed bearing the old duke's true intention, drawn up at last in language even a magistrate could not mistake. Some of them wept, plainly, in the estate office, over a piece of paper that had cost them nothing, and had been theirs, in truth, for longer than they knew. The dowager's manner toward the bookbinder's daughter did not soften all at once. She was not a woman given to sudden warmths, but it changed, by degrees, the way weather changes, so that one noticed only afterward that the wind had turned. She began to ask, without preamble, whether the library's cataloging progressed to satisfaction. She began to say, "The young woman," where once she had said, "The girl from the bindery." And though the correction was small, the household marked it, as households mark such things. By midsummer she had taken to sending down her own copy of the estate accounts for a second opinion, a courtesy she extended to no one else living. The months that followed settled into a rhythm the house had not known in years. Ladders against high shelves, dust sheets folded and set aside, the smell of leather dressing and beeswax replacing, slowly, the smell of neglect. Eleanor catalogued in a hand grown steadier with practice, working through the old duke's collection volume by volume, correspondence by correspondence, under terms that were her own now, written and signed, with wages paid on the quarter, and a key that hung, at day's end, from a ring she kept in her own pocket, rather than borrowed from the housekeeper's board. The new duke came to the library often, on one pretext or another, and stayed longer than the pretext required. It was on a Tuesday in June, with the light gone the color of weak tea through the western windows, that he found her still bent over the old Duke's correspondence. A single candle burned down to its last inch beside her elbow. She had not heard the door. She had not heard, either, the clock in the passage strike the half-hour or the 6 that had come before it. He stood a moment in the doorway before speaking, watching the way her pen moved without haste, without the small, anxious corrections she had made in the first weeks, when every stroke of the old Duke's hand had seemed a code within a code, a thing that might yet slip from her. "You will ruin your eyes," he said, working by that light. She looked up then, marking the hour on his face before she marked it on the clock. "I had not noticed the dark come on." "No," he said. "You rarely do, when you are at this." He crossed to the table, not to the papers, but to the chair beside hers, the same chair, though the household no longer remarked upon its use, having grown, over the months, accustomed to seeing it occupied. He did not sit. He stood with one hand resting on its back, and for a moment said nothing at all, as though weighing some ledger of his own. "I have had the wages drawn up through Michaelmas," he said at last, "and a second key cut, in case the first is lost." He set it on the table before her. Plain iron, still faintly warm from his pocket. "Keeper of the library. Not archivist, not charity. I should like it written so, if you are willing." She looked at the key rather longer than the matter required, and when she looked up again, there was something in her face that had not been there in the draughty hall where she had first stood among the servants, waiting to be sent away. "I am willing," she said. "Good," he said, and did not move to go. The candle guttered once, steadied. Beyond the window, the last light was going out of the beach avenue, and somewhere below, a door closed, and a dog barked once at nothing. He remained standing by her chair a moment longer than duty required, long enough that the silence itself became a kind of speech, understood by both and spoken by neither, before he inclined his head, said good night, and left her to the candle and the quiet and the years of paper still waiting to be read, in a hand that only she, of all the house, could follow to its end.